Much for joining us today. I'm sorry I'm caught a little bit short. The only joke I can make today is I've never seen my department chair say as little as he just said. That is amazing. So congratulations to Tim for keeping us on time. I don't want to be the one to put us behind. Bill, are you ready to go? Okay, we'll get started right away. I did just want to say a few thank yous here at the beginning. This program was put together by largely by Zoe Plakias, who she's not in the room right now, but she'll be here all day. Hopefully many of you have met her. A huge amount of work, but we had a lot of help from three special people who I wanted to just mention right now. When we first started talking about this program, Greg Davis in OSU Extension, we asked him, who should we talk to really get some insights and advice on how to develop this, and he had three great names. So Zoe and I went to those folks and asked them to join us as to help plan this. And they gave us a huge number of ideas. So Nancy Bowen, James Morris, and Gwen Stewart really helped a ton. And I want to thank them for their assistance in putting together this program. We couldn't have done it without their actual advice. It was really fantastic. So without any more for me, I do want to introduce our first speaker today, Bill Lafayette. Many of you have undoubtedly heard of Bill Lafayette. He's the owner of Regionomics, a local economic consulting firm. This is a firm that, you read about this all the time in the newspaper and elsewhere, the work they do to understand what's happening in the economy, both in Ohio as well as in the local area in Columbus and other parts of the state. Bill is a graduate of Wright State University and a graduate with a PhD from The Ohio State University. So without further ado, I'll welcome Bill to the podium. Thanks a lot, Bill.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let's see how I get this started. I just want to do charts. Oh, the founder of the feast.
I'm guessing this is you.
Oh, yes. Why, yes. There you are. All right. Groovy. Thank you. All right. Well, what I'm going to do for you this morning is I'm going to start with a quick overview of the national economy, just to give you a little bit of context. And then I'm going to focus in on Ohio. This coming July, the expansion that we're in hits the 10-year and 1-month mark. And why that's such a signal date is that it will then become the longest expansion in American history. And the national level forecasts are for at least another year of growth. And so it is very, very likely that we are going to hit that milestone. Now, every quarter, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve sends out a survey to people who forecast the national economy. And their first quarter survey attracted responses from 36 economists. And so what they do is they take these responses and they average them, which gives us a really nice kind of middle of the road idea of what people are thinking. And one of the questions that they asked was, what is the likelihood of a down quarter over the next 5 quarters? And it turns out that the odds of a down quarter, according to these economists, are under 20% through the 4th quarter of 2019. The 1st quarter of 2020 is only 22%. So we've got a good bit of runway left. I should, of course, caution you that there's always the chance of something unforeseen happening, and recessions can come on without a whole lot of warning. So we have to keep our eyes peeled, but there's no reason right now to think that we're going to run out of growth over the next year. So what I have here is a chart of annualized quarterly growth in gross domestic product, the sum total of all goods and services produced in the US. This is a quarterly chart that begins in 2016. The blue bars to the left are GDP. The purple bars are consumer expenditures. We really like to focus on consumer expenditures because they're 71% of the overall economy. And the hatched bars to the right are the average forecast for GDP growth from the Philadelphia Fed survey through the first quarter of 2020. The forecast for the second quarter is 2.4%. 2.2% in the third and fourth quarters, and 2.1% at the beginning of 2020. Now, first quarter growth was a real shocker to everybody. It was 3.2%. The Philadelphia Fed forecast was for less than 2%. And so this really caught everybody off guard. And it turns out, though, that there is somewhat less to this 3.2% than meets the eye. The first point is something that you can see on the chart. Over the last 3 quarters, we've had a troubling decline in consumer expenditure growth. The first quarter growth was 1.2%. And so that growth rate has declined by 2/3 in the last 3 quarters. And durable goods, goods that are expected to last for more than 3 years, actually contracted in the first quarter. And that contraction subtracted about 0.4 percentage points off of total growth. Durable goods are a mainstay of the Ohio economy. And so that result was not at all good news for us here in Ohio. Turns out that a full percentage point of that 3.2% growth was due to net exports, exports minus imports. That's one of the most volatile components of GDP. So we cannot expect that to hold in coming quarters. And it's also a component that can be revised relatively substantially. And so the revisions to this 3.2% estimate over the next 2 months, when they bring out their second and third estimates of first quarter growth, may be pretty sizable. We'll just kind of have to wait and see. Another point is that 0.7% percentage points of the 3.2% was due to inventory buildup, which has been building for the last 3 quarters. That adds to growth now, but subtracts from growth later. So one thing that might make the decline in consumer expenditures a little bit less worrisome is that consumer confidence is holding. What I have here is the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index. This chart is monthly, beginning at the beginning of 2007, and the shaded area there is the recession. As you can see, the index from month to month is really volatile, but the overall trend recently is kind of flat to very slightly upward. Contrast that with the very steep decline that we saw in consumer confidence going into the recession, almost a month or almost a year before the recession started. Consumer confidence started to decline. So that is at least a positive sign that we may see a return to growth in consumer expenditures. So let me now narrow the focus to Ohio. This is the trend in Ohio and US total employment growth from February 2010 through March of 2019. February 2010 is when employment bottomed out and started increasing again after the recession ended. What I've got here is a graph on an index basis. And so what this is showing is cumulative percentage growth in US employment, which is the black line, and Ohio employment, which is the blue line. Ohio has added a touch less than 600,000 jobs over the last 9 years, and that gives us net growth of 12% in employment. The US, though, is up more than 16%. As you can see, we started out growing a little bit faster than the US average. For 3 years in a row, we were either at or above the US trend. And that's the first time we've managed that since the late 1940s. So that was a really unusual period. But beginning in the spring of 2012, growth started to slow. Between then and March 2019, Ohio employment grew 7%, but US employment grew more than 11%. Now, you may have heard last year that Ohio's employment gains had really picked up and were starting to beat the national average again, and that in October, we finally beat the record high employment total that was set back in May 2000. And we all felt very good about that. Sadly, though, all that was based on preliminary estimates that were revised downward pretty substantially in March. So the current estimate is that Ohio's gain from December 2017 to December 2018 was only 0.8% compared to 1.8% for the US. And we still have 36,000 jobs to go before we beat the May 2000 record. And at our current pace, that's going to take us another year. But it turns out that this all really isn't telling the story. What I always like to say when I'm describing the Ohio economy is that there is no such thing as the Ohio economy. We are actually a collection of very localized economies with very different dominant industries and very different economic performance. The common idea is that there's Central Ohio and everywhere else. And to some extent, that is a true statement, because Central Ohio's economic performance over the last decade has been so far greater than the rest of the state, and in fact, greater than the national average, that it meaningfully increases statewide average employment and population growth. What I have here is my employment chart again, and I've got a new little dashed line down there at the bottom, which is the 5.6 million jobs of Ohio, less the 1.1 million jobs that we have here in Central Ohio. And as you can see, that really deflates the employment growth of the rest of the state. We're at 10% rather than 12%. So that's Columbus versus the rest of the state. But beyond that, it turns out that Toledo is different from Cleveland, and Cleveland is different from Akron, even though Cleveland and Akron are only 30 miles apart, and so forth throughout the state. This is an illustration of what I'm talking about. This shows the indexed employment growth of Ohio's 6 big metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs. since early 2010. MSAs are collections of counties that are defined by the federal government based on commuting patterns. So an MSA is, in a very real sense, an economic unit. And so the 6 metros I have here are Akron, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, and Toledo. Akron's in 2 counties. Dayton and Toledo are in 3 counties. Cleveland is in 5 counties. Columbus is in 10, and Cincinnati's in 15. Cincinnati's MSA is in 3 states, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, but about 80% of total Cincinnati MSA employment is in Ohio. The straight black line there at the second highest point is the US. That's much smoother than the individual MSA trends, which are bouncier simply because of sampling error. And this chart shows that only one of these MSAs, namely Columbus, the red line there, has had economic growth, employment growth, significantly greater than the national average. Columbus growth over this period has totaled 21% versus the 16% national average. Cincinnati, right below the US line, is a distant second, 9-year growth of 15%. The other 4 MSAs are kind of hanging out between 8% and 11%. And there are 6 other smaller MSAs that are based in Ohio, either partly or completely within the state. And as you can see, these are much worse off. The best of them, which is the line on top, Canton, is up 10.5% since February 2010. Lima, Mansfield, and Springfield, which are kind of there in the middle, have gained only 3 to 4% in employment over the last 9 years. Youngstown employment, which is the second from the bottom, is up only 0.5%. Steubenville, down there at the bottom, is off more than 10%, but at least Steubenville employment has stopped declining. That's the one saving grace. Now, as far as Youngstown's concerned, they are experiencing a huge blow with the shutdown of the Lordstown GM plant, which is just north of into Trumbull County. And that is going to be absolutely cataclysmic for the Youngstown economy. I did some quick calculations, very informal, looking at the impact of losing not only the plant, but also all the secondary businesses, including the businesses that were meeting the needs of the households of the workers. And it looks to me like that shutdown could blow a 10% hole in their employment and their GDP. So it is a really, really serious problem, not just for Youngstown, but for the state. Unfortunately, we don't have current numbers on employment growth in Ohio's rural areas. The 2018 averages are going to be out this summer. Now, I do a bi-monthly article for Hannah News Service that talks about various aspects of the state's economy. The August issue always uses the new estimates when they just come out to do a regional analysis of employment growth. And so last August, I looked at the growth of these more rural regions between 2010 and 2017, and they were definitely a mixed bag. My East North Central region, which includes Amish country, beat the state and every MSA except Columbus. It it's done quite well. Western Ohio, outside of Dayton, was only slightly below the state average, but the southeast part of the state, Appalachian Ohio, came in about 2/3 the state average, and the South, which wound up being less than half the state average. Now, Ohio's relatively weak employment growth has persisted not just in this expansion, but over the last 40 years. And in my opinion, there are two primary interrelated causes of that slow growth. And the first cause is Ohio's focus on manufacturing. Manufacturing has dominated Ohio's economy for decades. Manufacturing doesn't have the largest number of jobs. Statewide healthcare and government each have more jobs than manufacturing, but manufacturing's employment concentration is so far above average that it is the primary reason why Ohio employment changes differ from national employment changes. Manufacturing employment statewide is almost half again as high as you would expect in an economy Ohio's size. The manufacturing employment share is far above average throughout the state in all the individual regions, except in central Ohio and the southeast. Employment in manufacturing is 16% less in the Columbus MSA than you would expect in an economy our size, and only just slightly above average in the southeast. But the concentration in some of the smaller MSAs and rural regions can be 2 to 3 times what you would expect. The manufacturing share is generally higher in the smaller MSAs than in the larger ones. Manufacturing plants need large developable tracts, and large tracts of land are generally cheaper around smaller cities. This also explains why the manufacturing share is relatively low in southeast Ohio. The terrain makes large flat parcels relatively uncommon and developmental costs relatively high. So here is the manufacturing employment trend since February 2010. Again, the black line is the US, the blue line is Ohio. And this explains in its entirety the trend that I showed you earlier. Ohio's manufacturing employment grew far faster than the state average or the national average through mid-2012, and then it slowed to approximately average afterward. Notice that both state and national employment trends flattened in mid-2015 and then took off again in 2017 and 2018. However, since mid-2017, Ohio manufacturing employment's up 2.2%, while the US is up 3.3%, which again explains the recent weakness in Ohio employment growth. On the other hand, here's what happened during the last expansion to manufacturing employment, 2003 to 2007. US manufacturing employment through that period declined 5.9%, but the Ohio decline was 10.6%. That hit Ohio employment hard, both because of the larger than average decline in employment and manufacturing's larger than average concentration. So during this expansion, total employment nationally grew 6.3%, which was nothing particular to write home about, but the employment growth was only 0.2% in Ohio during that entire expansion. But manufacturing employment, as many of you probably know, is especially unhelpful in indicating the health of manufacturing companies. And this chart I have here shows you why. This goes from 1997 to 2007. The downward trending line is manufacturing employment. The upward trending line is manufacturing output. So manufacturing employment during this decade declined 20%. The output of manufacturing firms rose 43%. And what was going on was technology was substituting for labor that allowed fewer workers to produce more goods. Output per worker doubled over this period, which is an increase in productivity that's absolutely off the charts. And it may be that the increase in manufacturing employment that we've been seeing in this expansion is because the reduction in employment before and during the recession went too far. But over the long run, technology is going to continue to improve and will continue to substitute for labor. That's happening in more and more industries, not just manufacturing. Manufacturing, and for that matter, agriculture, are just the first two examples. Please note, though, that I am not saying that a manufacturing focus is a bad thing. It is just a thing. We need to recognize that focus, recognize its impact, and plan our economic growth with that in mind. It definitely makes our economy more cyclical. The second reason, I think, that Ohio's employment has been so weak over the last 40 years is our very slow population growth. What I have here is a chart that compares Ohio's population growth, right there at the top is Ohio, to the US, which is the black bar second down, to the 6 big metro areas. Total growth over the 18 years that I've charted this, from 2000 to 2018, is for Ohio 2.6%, the US 15.4%. Columbus is again an outlier with growth of 25%. Ohio's population has increased 336,000 since 2000, total growth of 3%. But the Columbus MSA has increased 431,000. So the population of the rest of Ohio, on balance, has declined by 95,000 since 2000. Cincinnati, including Kentucky and Indiana counties, gained 9.5%. Akron's next down with a gain of about 1%. Dayton has broken even after a couple years of growth. Toledo has lost 2.5%. Youngstown, or Cleveland rather, lost 4.2%. And all of the smaller MSAs lost population. Steubenville and Youngstown have both lost 11% since 2000. One somewhat hopeful sign, though, is that Mansfield, which is only Richland County, increased 500 in 2018. Its first gain since at least 2000, and probably much earlier than that. The Springfield MSA, my hometown, which is only Clark County, is still losing, but at a much slower rate over the last couple years than it was losing earlier. Slow population growth leads to a lack of available workforce for the companies that want to expand. Attracting companies and their jobs to Ohio is all well and good, but it turns out that the expansion of existing companies is what really matters. Over the last 20 years, more than 80% of Ohio's total job growth was driven by existing employers' expansion. If the labor force isn't growing, neither can the companies that are trying to hire. I think this is probably the major reason why our manufacturing growth has been less than average, at least for much of the recent history. Simply put, manufacturers are starved for workers. And this, unfortunately, is a problem that's going to continue. This chart shows you past and projected growth in 4 big age groups in Ohio between 2000 and 2050. The future growth comes from state projections. The light blue line, second from the bottom, is 24 and younger. 25 to 44 is purple there down on the bottom. 45 to 64, that line that increases and then falls, is second from the top. And then at the top, you have the population 65 and older. The dashed gray line is total population growth. And so what this chart is very clearly showing is that what growth the state will have over the coming decades will be driven by the senior population. That population is projected to be 142,000 more in 2040 than it was in 2017, an increase of 53%. That population was 13% of all people in Ohio in 2000. It's 15.5% now, but it's going to top out at more than 20% in 2035 before it starts to decline as we baby boomers start to die off. Meanwhile, the working age population, if you can't say something nasty, don't say anything at all. That's the economist's creed. The projections imply that the working age population is going to decline. You saw a big drop in the 25 to 44 group since 2000. That's been offset, fortunately, recently by an increase in the 45 to 64 group, but the projections imply that that gravy train is about to stop. The 45 to 64 group is now starting to decline as its members age into the senior population, and meanwhile, the 25 to 44 group is barely going to grow at all. So the population between 25 and 64, essentially the working age population, will be 455,000 smaller in 2030 than it was in 2015, a net decline of 7.5%. In any event, the slower increase in the working age population is a national phenomenon, although probably not to this extent. So we can expect more and more and more jobs to be replaced by technology. And it's an open question whether the technology wins or the decline in the working age population wins. The second reason why slow population growth is a problem is its net impact on business growth in general. There are broad swaths of the economy that serve a local market: retail, restaurants, business and personal services, a whole lot of healthcare, and more. And so if the population base isn't expanding, individual companies can only grow by poaching customers from their competitors, and so total regional growth stagnates. So where do we go from here? The risk of negative tariff impacts is real. Trump ramped up his tariff tweets again earlier this week. Existing and threatened tariffs hit Ohio much harder than they hit other places. Another impact that's going to weigh on Ohio's employment growth is slower Columbus growth. I have never formally done a forecast of Ohio employment, but I've been doing one for the for the Columbus region, Central Ohio, for the last 20 years. Last year was the first time since 2007 when Columbus employment growth was less than the national average. And the problem seems to be that our employment growth is finally maxing out our workforce availability. I'm predicting only 1.2% growth in 2019, down from the mid-2s a couple, 3 years ago. That's going to pull Ohio growth down rather than pulling it up. We have to address the workforce problem. That is probably the major problem that we in Ohio face. And an important task there is to induce more people to move here. And that includes immigrants, who are an important component of total statewide growth, and indeed growth in Central Ohio too. We also need more graduates from our colleges and universities to stay put after they graduate. Career-focused internships are a really, really great way of doing that. So that is what I wanted to share with you. Thanks a lot for listening. I don't know. Thank you. Any time for questions? Okay. Yes.
I guess I appreciate your analysis that Ohio is a collection of local regional economies, that there's differences among the big Northeast Ohio compared to Columbus region. Do you think our economic development incentives that we're using statewide, Northeast Ohio talks a lot about legacy, brownfields, aged infrastructure, things like that. Yet those programs sometimes are very difficult to do. So, as a state, do you think we offer the right portfolio of incentives to deal with it?
Well, as it turns out, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, I partnered with the Greater Ohio Policy Center to do an economic impact analysis on brownfields. And the benefits of providing incentives to remediate brownfields are really strong. And on top of that, there's the kind of unmeasurable impact on community, just the community fabric, the look and feel of the community. So that's certainly something that I really, really hope is going to ramp back up. Anything else? Going once? Yes, Mark.
But the cause and effect between brownfield revitalization and attracting people into the state, or getting or educating people to stay, is not. You're not saying there's a cause and effect there. Okay.
No, not necessarily. Although it certainly helps if a big, ugly, seeping brownfield is removed from the middle of a relatively small city. It just opens up land for development, keeps communities more compact, and just the activity itself generates jobs and income and wealth. Yes.
You said at the end that internships were, a good idea to bring people in.
One of many.
Do you have any specifics on that, on how maybe companies could be incentivized to offer more internships, be more active in that arena? Any examples that you want to
Well, long ago in a galaxy far away, I was economist at the Columbus Chamber of Commerce. And we had a very active program at the time, not only incentivizing internships, but helping companies get the most out of their interns. I had a steady stream of interns, and I put them to work. So the thing that you don't want to do is hire an intern who gets coffee and runs copies and stuff like that. You got to get them to do real work. And that can be a bit of a barrier for some companies because they don't have the time. But you invest a little time and your workload diminishes. Yes.
If you were anyone in Ohio, give any thought to the message, the implications of the Japanese economy and its aging population for Ohio?
You better believe it. I've certainly talked about it and thought about it. The point is that the Japanese economy is in worse shape than we are, as far as the aging of the population goes. Part of the reason for that is their very, very restrictive immigration policies. And so I'm really concerned about the turn that we're taking these days as far as welcoming immigrants to our country. I was talking about this problem, and others were 10 years ago. And I was saying it's coming down the pike, be prepared, and by golly, here it is. So yeah, that's a very powerful message. Yes.
You didn't talk much about minimum wage. What will the minimum wage do?
The minimum wage is not an easy question, one way or the other. The people who say it will lead to no job loss are wrong. The people who say that it will lead to every job being lost are wrong. It's somewhere in the middle. And it's a very, very complex interaction of the productivity of individual occupations, the productivity of workers, the impact of losing some jobs to the jobs that remain, and also the greater spending power of the workers. So people have actually asked me to do an economic impact on increasing the minimum wage. And I looked at it and I thought about it and I read some background materials, and I wound up just throwing up my hands and saying it's too complicated. I can't model it. So that is kind of a non-answer, but that's what I know. Yes.
You gave some examples. You said how Columbus is outpacing a lot of the other states, other cities, or manufacturing cities. What about specifically Finland, or a little bit more of a white collar city with Marathon there? How is that on the scale?
I don't know. Findlay is obviously part of the region that I'm looking at. My guess is it's probably fairly good, simply because you've got areas of Western Ohio, which is what that area is, what Hancock County is, I do believe, that really aren't doing very well. And so my guess off the top of my head is that Findlay's probably doing fairly well, but I'd have to go and look at the number. Yes.
I work with a lot of communities in southeastern Ohio, and there's definitely a mindset for manufacturing.
Right.
And trying to encourage manufacturing, probably going back to better days. Do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to encourage them to diversify beyond just basic manufacturing?
It's a hard nut to crack, simply because they figure that manufacturing was the gravy train before, and all they have to do is, as you say, bring it back and they'll be all right. Springfield has done a very interesting job of diversifying its economy. They brought in the Speedway headquarters. They've gotten into financial services. They've attracted a big call center for insurance, Code Blue, I think it's called. The problem is educational attainment, which is not good in Clark County, nor is it good in any of the surrounding counties except Greene. And everybody in Greene County works either at the base or in Dayton. And so that is probably the most serious stumbling block that you've got to diversifying your economy, simply because so many jobs in other sectors require at least a 2-year degree. Yeah.
Is this recent interest in improving broadband access throughout rural world?
Yeah, right.
Is there any logic to that? Is it going to really work or not?
It will certainly attract more companies, simply because that's, I mean, it's a utility just like water and electricity are. It's also going to help with education, simply because students and adult learners will have access to better internet connectivity. So it will have benefits, there's no doubt about it. I haven't looked deep enough to quantify them, but it certainly makes sense to me. All right.
Thanks, Bill. We really appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
I just wanted to, my own personal perspective, highlight a couple things that Bill said that really caught my attention. First off, he said that something about the baby boomers. I forget what that was, but and not in the same order. Not in the same order. He mentioned it's just a thing. So I don't know. Just keep that in mind, I guess. As the day goes on, it's just a thing. So I have one other thing for you, and I apologize. We've never had this happen. Our second speaker has not arrived yet. So what we're going to do is call an audible. Anyone who's at Ohio State University for the day will know what an audible is. So we're going to call one of those, and we're going to switch the order of our speakers, but we need to take about a 5-minute break. So I want to take about a 5-minute break. Zoe will come up and speak next, and then we'll hope to continue this program in just about 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. So take a break, get some coffee. We'll switch the second break to a little bit shorter. Thank you. So Ned has arrived, so we'll go on with our program as scheduled. We will take the full 40 minutes for Ned's talk. We'll take about 10 minutes of your break. I do apologize for that, but there should be a 20-minute break, plenty of time to grab some extra coffee if you actually need it at that time. And that's mainly also for folks who are online to know sort of what our schedule will be. So thanks for your patience. You know, I feel this is a great honor for me today. I get to introduce what I would consider some economic titans in Ohio. So Bill Lafayette being one individual I've heard a lot about over the years and have gotten an opportunity to meet. And Ned Hill as well, our next speaker. Heard a lot about him. I first was hearing about him when Larry Libby was our Swank chair. And he talked about this guy, Ned Hill at Cleveland State University and the work he was doing. And so I learned a lot about that, about him then. And really enjoyed sort of reading about and seeing what he's done. And then he moved to Ohio State. I haven't got to meet him yet, so I'm glad to meet him in person. It's a great honor to introduce Ned. He's got an undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD from MIT. He's one of those folks who understands sort of how economies relate to geography, how people interact within economies, and has done a lot to understand, I think, sort of in addition to what we learned this morning about the manufacturing, a lot about the manufacturing in the state of Ohio and how it relates to our economy and how important it is. So without further ado, Ned Hill, who is right now a professor in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs. So without further ado, Ned, thanks so much.
Yeah, Brett, pleasure. Good morning, everybody. Now, I am so good at spatial stuff, I went to the wrong building. So just take that as a warning. I'm going to be talking much more about community development today than about economic development.
And the reason for doing that is I want to talk about the other Ohio. The Ohio that's not on I-71, the 3C corridor. The Ohio that is not prospering along I-75 because of the revival of auto manufacturing. I want to spend some time talking about and help you begin to think about the Courthouse Square, Ohio. The Ohio that was part of the fabric that made us a great state. I also want you at the same time to draw a set of connections between that other Ohio and forgotten Ohio, which is inner city Ohio. And many times, and we look at the data that John Bagala's put together, we're seeing the same set of social problems, same levels of drug addiction, similar levels of teenage pregnancy. But what's most disturbing of all is we can't find investment. And we're finding communities that really isn't in the top of mind of public policy and that we've been disinvesting in for a long time. And as an academic, I can publish that and go on from there and I'm done. But I decided that leaving you in a state of profound depression probably is not one of the best things to do, because what we're beginning to find out that there are green shoots in the other Ohio. We think about the work that Jim Rackauckas is doing, bringing land banks around all corners of the state. We're beginning to see what the impact that natural gas could have in parts of Appalachian Ohio. We're in an absolute battle royal down at the State House to keep First Energy from screwing up the electricity rates and hurting investments in Ohio. We're fighting the legislature to prevent them from engaging in crony capitalism and lemon socialism. And this plays into this subject because if it becomes harder to invest in the state of Ohio, it becomes even harder to invest in the other Ohio. So what I want us to do today is I'm going to go through some of the issues. I'm going to give you some rules of thumb that I've observed, developed by observing communities. And I'm also going to ask you to start thinking about a playbook to bring back the other Ohio. Because this is what is absolutely brutally clear. It's clear from Portsmouth to Chillicothe. It's clear from Salina to Circleville. What's clear is that these communities have to take leadership themselves. They can no longer hope that someone from the outside is going to parachute in with bags of money and change their futures. So what I'm going to do today is think about asset-based strategies for the other Ohio. And remember, while I may be primarily showing pictures of Courthouse Square towns of counties that no longer have enough population to be viable, I also want you to think about inner city neighborhoods because the rules are the same. So let's see. Nice. Oh. I'll go this way. No, I won't. Down arrow. Let's see. How about we go like this? Right now, we're at the frozen Ohio. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right, what just happened?
Okay, we probably just didn't have it selected, so try it now.
All right. Okay. So I am kind of I am not usually stayed to a podium, but there's this little thing over here. Hi, guys. So I do this. So let's say the first thing that's really important to understand is pay attention to those guys over on the left-hand side of the screen. Those are two working guys. They came out of a factory. One says to the other, there it is again, the invisible hand of the marketplace has given us the finger. This is the way that most of us have thought about our economic future. You go up, Dave Claiborne's here from Marion, and he's talked about how Marion has basically taken victories and said, but it's still not the past. And we think about, but when I look at it, Marion, it's a community that's pulled itself together and started making a way to the future. So the fact is that victims never prosper. No one follows Eeyore. They'll pet Eeyore on the head, say it's cute, and then wish it was damn Tigger instead. So one of the things that we have to do, and this has happened in Cleveland, you know, the overnight sensation that was 40 years in the making, we had to get over a profound sense of victimhood. We had to stop blaming the outside, even though there has been public policy at the national level and trade and things are different. But the fact is that if we believe we are victims, we've increased risk for outside money. And we've also made it risky for us to invest in our own homes. So the first most important asset we have is the attitude of the people in the community itself. The other thing that we have to realize is that the purpose of a community changes over time. Now, what's fascinating to me is this map. I made certain it was in small font, so you did not know what was really there. Is a map of the Ohio Canal system from the 1880s. And if you look at the towns that were important way stops along that canal system, what you're really seeing is a list of communities that have been abandoned, disinvested. That's where, in fact, tomorrow night in Portsmouth, Ohio, they're having what they're calling it's almost an anti-Prozac rally, an anti-opioid rally, basically attacking the national media for only referring them to as a pill mill, as opposed to being a place that's revitalized. Portsmouth is one of those cities. So the purpose of a community changes over time, but if a community stays rooted ruthlessly in the past, it's not going to make its way forward. Economic purpose changes over time. So here's Pope John Paul. He died. He goes to heaven. The angel Gabriel meets him at the gates. He sees a big bucket of wings sitting there. And Gabriel explains to John Paul, we design them here, but labor's cheaper in hell. Purpose changes. And as industry ages and as products age, what happens is vibrancy also changes. So that means that we can't look back to the 1950s to find the purpose of our communities. Remember, the 50s were the time of Ozzie and Harriet. Harriet divorced Ozzie, he's now dead, and she's going to the old age home. We gotta figure something different. And we also have to realize is that you can't manage decline in a market economy. Decline is slow strangulation, but strangulation in what? If we try to go back to, Portsmouth wants to go back to the population it had in the 1960s, it's never gonna get there. It has to figure out a way and a path to success based with what's there and attracting what's new. So we have to learn from boiled frogs. All right, I'll leave and you try to figure out what the hell that means. But when you're thinking about if we're cooking up a bunch of frogs, what you do is you put them in a pot that's cold and slowly turn up the heat, and they're going to jump out when it gets hot enough. And what happens with slow decline and managing decline is it changes expectations, and you can't rally around change because, oh God, it's just watching the glacier melt. But the glaciers are melting faster. The other thing is if a place is not nice, it is dying. And nice is something as an economist I cannot define, but damn, I know it when I see it. Nice is safe. Nice is welcoming. Nice is invested in. And the single most important thing that the other Ohio has to do is make certain that it has a graft-free but very aggressive and relentless building department and building code enforcers. And if you've got one slumlord owning your downtown, wrestling out of his greedy, dying fingers. Otherwise, you don't have control of your future. If the locals do not invest, people from away won't either. Did a lot of work in Duluth, Minnesota. I did so much work in Duluth, Minnesota, I can refer to it as Duluth and get away with it. But in Duluth, we interviewed every single person with money that had a history of real estate investment to try to figure out why they were investing in Scottsdale, Arizona, rather than their hometown of Duluth. And it was fascinating to find out that every single one of them was dying to invest in their community because they saw value, they saw opportunity, but they also saw a contentious city council that second-guessed everything and despised people who made money. It was easier to do it in Scottsdale. So they turned willing investors into heat-seeking geezers. So what we have to pay attention to, and this is where the optimistic side comes in, is realize that success depends on playing the long game and having a widely held strategy across the community. Why? Because economic development time is 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And if you want success in 2 to 3 years, I guarantee you failure. I guarantee you following fads. I guarantee you buying too many of Richard Florida's books. Oh, damn, did I say that? Oh, well. But it also depends on having a widely held strategy. Why? Because the life of a community can no longer be determined by 3 fat white guys sitting in a closet somewhere and rolling out and saying this is the future. It also can't depend on one single mayor, because one single mayor is going to hit a limit and it's going to be there for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, not economic development time. Unless you're Don Pasquale, then you've got a century in Akron and things do change. So really, you need a vision of what the future could be. And I don't even care about the blocking and tackling strategy that ends up in a planning and zoning map. I want a reasonable, approachable sense of what our future is together. So community development then is a prerequisite. It's necessary for economic development to take place. But it's not sufficient. That takes investment. But I can guarantee you that if you do not invest in community development, if your schools suck, your roads are pitted, you drive down Main Street and it just looks like abandonment, I can guarantee you that economic development will not come. I will also guarantee you that if you're not well connected to a regional labor market and think regionally, that economic development will also not come. Why? Because the other Ohio is far enough away from the major metropolitan areas, those with more than 1 million people, that it doesn't have enough population to get the big attraction project coming from another country. Talk to my friends at Jobs Ohio frequently, and what they keep on saying is it's driving us crazy. We can't get anybody to look south of Circleville. What's magical about Circleville? Is there a big wall there? No, what's magical is it's the last community in the Columbus metropolitan area, and it's the last community that can claim the number of workers in Columbus. So that means Chillicothe, Portsmouth, and Piketon, and we can go down that lovely highway, which is absolutely beautiful, and realize you guys have to market yourself together and your connection to Cincinnati, your connection to Columbus, and make certain that you make regionalism work for you. So community development, I put these couple of pictures up here because they're kind of amazing. The Newsweek cover is Carl Stokes, the first African-American in the city of Cleveland. Phenomenal human being, great family. I didn't know the mayor well, I knew the congressman pretty well. But Carl Stokes was America's first environmental mayor. Why? Lake Erie was dying. They used to pour chlorine in a fenced off part of a park so the kids can go swimming. And of course, we had all the litany of the river catching fire, even though in Cleveland it was kind of a shrug. The 1952 fire was bigger. But Carl Stokes knew that from his community, from the Huff neighborhood where he grew up, Fairfax community, which he represented, he understood that the city as a whole had to prosper if his constituents were going to prosper. And the thing next to it is a note he received from a kid that lived in Lyndhurst. All this, by the way, is in the Stradling Brothers book, Where the River Burned, which is a terrific book about Carl Stokes, the environmental mayor of Cleveland, and the coalition that brought it together. So I recommend you to read it. But it's not alone. That other picture way up in the top corner, that's Great Lake St. Mary's, Grand Lake St. Mary's, when the place where the first oil well was drilled. And it was also an economic development tool because that lake was done to provide water to the canal system. Now it's in its third life as a recreational amenity, and there it is today with algae. In fact, we knew that we had a bad algae problem in Grand Lake St. Mary's when a dog fell into it and died of toxic shock. Community development takes place before economic development. and realize that the problem we had in Toledo is the problem we had in the Ohio River, which is the problem we had in Grand Lake St. Mary's. And so part of community development is dealing with and tackling at those sites. So what we all have to do is just stay calm and play the long game. And all of us are in short-term jobs. The typical economic development director of community keeps their job for 5 years. The typical planning director, especially in a small town, keeps their jobs for up to about a decade. So it really means to play the long game that has to be built deeply into civic space, which really means that you need to function as a community before community development takes place, before economic development takes place, and that takes genuine leadership. Not the general Patton type of leadership. It's that connector that builds community. It's what happens at church suppers. It happens around the PTA. That is all part of what we have to do. So if we think about what brings the community together, and I just noticed the slide got all out of sequence, so I'm going to put it all up. There really are 4 P's that we have to play with, and they're all long-term. The very first of the P is people. We need engaged people, we need smart people, we need educated people, we need people that we invest in. We need to pay attention to those kids, and we have to pay attention when they're teenagers, and we have to be able to make certain that those that want to work have a chance to work, and they learn the habits of work. But we also need, and that's what the evolution of the prosthetic is about, we need constant product innovation. Because if you don't have product innovation and an active growing portfolio of products in the regional economy, you aren't going to have growth, you aren't going to have income growth, and you're going to slowly die. So even in Ohio's major metropolitan areas, particularly up in Northeast Ohio, which if you look at the industrial codes, is a broadly diverse economy, when you start plotting where they are and the age of their products, they have old products and slow growing products. The other thing that you need is the middle, figure is you need productivity. And I'm hearing people from the left complain about productivity. They're worried about people losing their jobs, not having another chance. Essentially, it's neo-Luddites coming back again, but realize that if you don't sell a product, you don't have economic development. If you do not sell a service, you do not have economic development. If you do not have increases in productivity, you cannot have wage gains. And if you do not have wage gains, you're going to be repelling your population rather than attracting your population. At the root is productivity. Here's the cool thing about it. The big way to affect productivity is not by taking your people and working them harder and reducing benefits. The way in which you improve productivity, which is value added for every hour work, is improve margin. And you improve margin by having better managers. You improve margin by inventing new product. You improve margin by engaging in process innovation and product innovation. But if you don't have companies with margin, you aren't going to have productivity. Means you don't have productivity and you can't have wage gains. And then the last thing, the things the planners focus on the most, is probably the least important, but it's in terms of the economy, most important in terms of community development, is you have to continually invest in good creative placemaking. That's part of reducing risk. Because the first thing an investor is going to do is drive down your main street, and if it looks like shit, you got problems. That's a technical term, by the way, I can say it. Oh, and I'm getting swapped out too. This is even better. So if you want to think about the elements of a strategy for a small place or a community, think about the 4 Ps: people, product, productivity, and place. It works. Here's playing the long game. Now, I found a postcard of what the main street of Kenton, Ohio looked like, and I dare you to go to Kenton, Ohio today and find the same feel and look of vibrancy. So how do you go about playing the long game? You have to provide immediate results and respond to crisis and politics. The single most important thing I learned from Cleveland and Cleveland's revival was one day when Jacobs Field opened. I still call it Jacobs Field. I'm not feeling progressive these days. And I went to Jacobs Field on opening, on that first, when they first opened up, and they had these great curved benches all along the outfield. And I sat on that bench and just listened for a couple hours as people were staring into the gate into left field. And what they said was absolutely jaw-dropping, but so enlightening. They looked, they stared, and they said, I didn't think we could do anything this nice here. They were victims. And what did they learn? A community that holds itself up to a high standard and takes a shot when opportunity presents itself. A community can change the way it thinks and feels, acts, and works. We also saw this. I don't have to go to Cleveland. I can go to Worcester, Ohio, which has the best Main Street manager in the state, that is really taking care of the fact that after Rubbermaid left and they lost 1.5 million square feet worth of employment, they took advantage of OARDC. They took advantage of the College of Worcester. They reinvested in their downtown, and they made certain that little micro sprawl didn't take place, to realize that the heart and soul of Worcester goes from the fairgrounds down to the end of that Main Street. And they made certain there was enough density, so they ran into each other as a community. I'm going to talk about third places in a second, but we have to realize that successful communities in the other Ohio provide two types of investments. They invest in people. It makes no difference if you are Linden or if you are, and then take your favorite abandoned county seat. You got to invest in people. You invest in the way they can interact socially as well as in schools. And then you have to invest in place. We have people running against the investment and communities investing in their own future. If you do not invest, decline wins. So you need to invest. The municipal corporation has to invest in its own future. You need to invest in access so you can get elsewhere and people can find you. You need to make certain that your anchor institutions are working. And now if you think about anchor institutions, you think about Ohio State, you think about an art museum, on and on from there. Every community has an anchor institution. You have to find it. You have to identify with it. And you have to figure out how that anchor provides value to the community and how that community provides value to the anchor so it doesn't leave. The smaller the community, the smaller the anchor, the looser that anchor is into the mud of the lake. That was a really terrible analogy. I got to get it out of my head. We also have to make certain that places are safe, because if places aren't safe, investment doesn't come and people leave. John Colm, who set up a great organization called WireNet, once told me that he described his job. He's an advocate for manufacturing neighborhood in Cleveland. And I said, John, what's your job? And he said, I take care of the dead dog problem. Damn, what a great job. I want that in my business card. What the hell's a dead dog problem? He said that when a dog dies on a tree line in front of a factory, the city doesn't care because that factory doesn't vote who takes care and cleans up that dead dog. Because if that dead dog stays there, that factory owner is not going to invest there. And if that dead dog occurs over and over and over again, suddenly that plant's in Berea, that plant's in Lake County, that plant's in Kentucky. You also have to be a just place. If you're a community that balances your book through traffic tickets, stop it right now because you're pissing people off. And if you find out that those people are your own citizens and they're just nuisance tickets, you got a problem. And you have to judge people by what they can do and what they contribute rather than who they are and who their people were or where they were from. And that is the great thing about Ohio's history. That's the state that we should be, and that's the state we were, and I do believe that's still the state that we are. We just can't let politics drive that out. We also need local government that's honest. Why? Because look at when Ohio was a place that you had to be, petty corruption at the municipal level could exist. Why? Because you made enough money or you earned enough money so you could put up with that nonsense. But that isn't here anymore. And in the other Ohio, that's seen as just padding and feather bedding, and everybody in that community knows who's on the take, who's getting duped, or why a building permit isn't being permitted, isn't being processed, or, oh, that's just local politics, and that breeds cynicism. And above all, we need to make certain that we have a culture of respect, because if we don't have respect, the other thing doesn't happen. You know what? We can all do that. And we do it in our own lives. We have to speak about it as community value. And that community value is the foundation of economic development. So here are the 6 ingredients for success. This is a picture from one of the great wall murals down in Portsmouth, Ohio. Every community needs an economic purpose, even if it's being a bedroom and supplier of work somewhere else. If you do not have an economic purpose, you are dying, and you're dying rapidly. And understand that purpose. And that purpose isn't holding on to the past, because that past is going to move. You need to deliver the basic services extremely well. The toughest job in the world is being a mayor. Good thing the two mayors here. I don't see Nan. Oh, good. So I'm safe, so I can talk about mayors. The toughest job in the world is being mayors. Why? Because mayor is not really a political position. Mayor could be a tribal position, but mayor is not a political position because the potholes have to be filled. The cops have to be there. The emergency services have to work there. The mayor has to make certain the city works. And if the city needs more cash, the mayor has to be able to stand up and explain to the constituents why and what. Look at Lakewood, Ohio. Lakewood, Ohio had the 3rd highest school property taxes going to schools in the state of Ohio. It was a community in transition, blue collar roots with rich people living out on the lake. What did the people in Lakewood, Ohio do? They took advantage of school building programs and made sure it stayed in dense neighborhoods, and they taxed themselves extra to make certain that those schools were built. And it all started with an investment in a library. And without that, the revitalization of Detroit Road and Madison would never take place. And that cool, dense, walkable neighborhood could have been abandoned. That takes a mayor. You also have to make certain educational services are provided and provided well. You need leadership, and the place has to have a sense of vibrancy. Because if a place isn't vibrant, people are going to stay inside their houses, shut the door, and watch some sort of cable television. They can't figure out how I should buy it anymore. And you need diversity. And diversity is all type. Diversity is age, sex, family structure, race, ethnicity. That diversity science that you are judging people based on what they can contribute rather than who they are, who their people were. And you need those catalysts of distinction. Here is a gateway that goes to the farmer's market in Delaware, Ohio. And if you looked at Delaware 12 years ago, 15 years ago, you saw a place that was clinically depressed. They should have just put Prozac in the water and got it over with. They used to be prideful about the fact that they were the lawnmower capital of the world, but the grass wasn't cut in public spaces. And leadership took place and invested in the courthouse and invested in a farmer's market and had quality investment around it. So what are the catalysts of distinction? The first, pride of place. If you are proud about where you're from, if you aren't willing to tell people that this is what you're part of and who you are, you lose them. You need plug and play social structure. That's what I've been referring to. You need a sense of trust in your elected officials. The reason why real estate investors didn't invest in Duluth was they didn't trust the political process. Political process didn't trust them. You need energy, and energy is people. It's not oil and natural gas. And you need civic risk-taking and resilience. And above all else, you need truly engaged citizens in an era where the newspaper is dead and dying. That's the hardest thing of all. And you need that through building dense civic networks. So what's the goal of all this? The goal of all this is to change the value of assets in your community. I did work in Camden, New Jersey a few years ago. In fact, well, a couple decades ago. In fact, just before the mayor was arrested for being bribed for going to an off-site hotel in Disneyland. But that's a different issue. He also got shag carpeting. The problem we had in Camden, one neighborhood actually had property values going up, and you had people complaining about gentrification. It wasn't gentrification. It's the only part of Camden where decline wasn't accelerating, and investment was going on ahead of disinvestment. You have to change those asset values. Remember, everything has a value. Assets can be negative, assets can be positive. Just think about what the housing crisis did with all those abandoned buildings throughout the entire state. And every single one of those abandoned buildings, boarded up buildings, destroyed asset value around it and had to be tackled. You need to make certain that as places go up, you have a hedge for affordability, but that essentially is you have to do it with markets, don't do it through mandates. And here's the real goal. The real goal for the other Ohio is changing your relative position in the regional economy. It's changing where you are in the residential real estate world. It's changing where you are in the commercial real estate world. It's saying there that if you're up in Holmes County, you got to see a place that by relentless investment driven by culture is one of the most successful rural counties in the United States, not just Ohio. That's important. So if we think about the 5 developments, economic development, community development, housing development, workforce development, commercial and industrial development, real estate development, we focus on economic development because that's the fun stuff. Those are new jobs. Realize you need successful community development before that takes place. And you have to be part of a successful regional labor market. Workforce development's regional. It's not just you on your own. So here are 10 guidelines to pay attention to. And I'm sure that somehow this mysterious PowerPoint can end up on your desk, so you don't have to take tons of notes. The first thing is you got to find your own compass. Because while you may go around and find examples of what works in other places, you have to adapt it for your own community. Don't just adopt it. My favorite example here is if you look at the Inner Harbor in Cleveland and you look at the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, they look the same. Why? Because they took the plans and just moved them. And they didn't change it to be Cleveland. It's taken 30 years to change it so it becomes Cleveland. Adapt, don't adopt. Second, realize this decline cannot be managed. That's physics. What can be managed? You can reimagine the future. That could be led and managed. You can reposition the community within your region. That can be managed through investment. And you can help make reinvestment happen by removing risk and removing unnecessary bureaucratic barriers and also exciting the community about its own future. But that public money at the local level is going to come in before private money. Market on its own will follow the path of lowest risk. 3, community counts and cynicism kills. That's the community value. 4, optimism is rooted that's rooted in reality reduces risk. Pie-eyed optimism, not rooted in reality, is just another person not to pay attention to. But it has to be real. 5, regions matter. And regions matter a couple of ways. One is the other Ohio is all too small to be an economy on its own, so it has to figure out how it fits into that larger economy. Regions matter because strategy differs by the size of the region and the community. Your distance from a big place. Mark Parcher is going to tell you about the difference in rural Ohio when you're close to or away from a metropolitan area. Regions are going to matter because assets are different by regions. Anchors are different by region. And location also matters because what happens in the broader region affects the perception of you. Remember that in economic development, the attraction target, the company from away that you want to come to your community is not going to find the other Ohio, it's too small. It's going to find a state, then a region, and then sites within that region. If you cannot play well regionally, you've just made it harder. And then you have to understand your anchor institutions. How location adds value to the anchor, and how the anchor contributes value to the community. I've seen anchor institutions that were built and rebuilt during the 60s and the 70s. They'll tell you it's Brauhaus architecture. Hell no, it's a bunker designed to keep people away and disconnect it from the street. So when you think about it, those anchors are going to be very different. Like I said, it may be a church, maybe a Lions Club. It's most likely your library. It can be the courts. And what I'm beginning to see in the other Ohio is people going for cheaper land away from the core and making the place less walkable and community more fragile. 7, discover what is unique about your community and build from there. Because if we aren't unique, there's no reason why anyone should visit you. And if you aren't unique, there's nothing to distinguish you. And if nothing distinguishes you, you can't change your position in the real estate market. I did a big community speech in Portsmouth in the fall. It was a terrific opportunity, and I just loved being there. And I started talking about how Portsmouth really should take on the mantle of being part of Appalachian culture in southeastern Ohio. Why are they giving to a bunch of New Yorkers who move to Athens and figure out what a mandolin is when they're 30? Hell, they say pawpaw and they think a dog is giving them the paw. And so I had this clown came up to me and said, no, we don't want that image here. Why? Because people are going to think we're a bunch of hicks and a bunch of rubes. And I say, well, if you try to pretend that something you aren't, you're proving you're a bigger rube than you were to start with. And the other thing is you can't fight that image because it's in reality. Embrace it, make it better. Don't leave it to Berea, Kentucky to get all the money. Well, I don't know if he's going to pay attention, but what the hell. And make no little plans, but make feasible and actionable plans. That will help guide your future. So revitalization is a very long journey. So that means we have to share that map for a very long period of time to a very large number of people and get people excited about what's taking place. I can feel that vibe in Lancaster starting to happen now. Very different when the vulture capitalists were ripping the guts out of Anchor Hocking and leaving it for dead. And they've overcome a lot. And they're adapting access to Columbus as being part of their future. But the architecture and the heritage of Lancaster is part of their future. Fabulous. The mile markers consist of physical signs of achievement. If all you're doing is lots of processing and a lot of meeting and a lot of consensus building, and we're going to get the wisdom from the crowd's crap, that's just process. And the only thing that's processed that Americans like is Velveeta cheese in mac and cheese. That's it. So that means every single year there's going to be a ribbon cutting. And every single year there's going to be a mark to success. Every single year there's going to be a celebration as to where the future is going to be. Why? Because that deters risk. So here I'm going to wrap up with 6 questions. I wonder if your community has the answers or you have the answers. So first, are you distinctive? If so, how? If you're another courthouse square town like the other 88 in the state, you're distinctive. Are you proud of who you are? Are you proud of what you can become? And is it not bullshit? 3, do you embrace newcomers? 4, are there third places and third spaces? The first place is home, the second place is work. Where are those third places so you can get together? And that's the beauty of the old courthouse square. That's the reason why as retail goes, coffee shops are being replaced and where little craft breweries are going all over the place. I hope it doesn't become the marijuana dispensary. Otherwise, the gummy bears are going to screw up your dog really bad. And are you willing to invest in your own future? If you aren't, move. And are you connected to the external economy? Because we have to trade. We're going to export labor. In rural Ohio, people will travel an open hour to get to work. It's not a problem. We got a beater culture. But what it actually takes is what Margaret Thatcher once said. No one would remember the Good Samaritan if they only had good intention. Get money well. You need some cash. So this is your assignment. This is your homework. We can't do it as a group. It's too bad because I talked too long. But you need to figure out with asset development-based development, what works. I would love it if every person here submitted to Zoe a small case study of what worked in your community. You ask the question, what are the examples of what seems to work to build economic vibrancy and community and gave people a sense of optimism that resulted in investment? How did it work? Why did it work? Here's the problem. When you guys bring in the fancy-ass academics to work with you, realize that we're social scientists. The only thing a social scientist is really trained to do is to reject a hypothesis. We cannot accept anything. So that means we are nattering nabobs of negativism all the time. You're on the other side. You're practitioners. You have to worry about the future. You're in the world of investment. You have to know what works and inductively tell us what works. How did it take place? Who's the leadership? And if I had a workshop right now, I would take whiteboards around the room and have you guys figure out what are the questions to ask and where the answer is going to come from. So even though I start talking about how big that rock is we got to push, realize that momentum happens with consistent small movements. Those lovely theaters that were saved in downtown Cleveland and Playhouse Square, it wasn't a big planner that came in to save them. It wasn't a big mayor that came in to see him. It was a worker in the public schools that needed a space for a meeting, that walked into the Playhouse and saw the ceilings crumbling and the place is deteriorating, and Ray decided to do something that made it his life work, and that was the start of Cleveland's revitalization. One person, one set of eyes, one incredibly determined human being, and he made change happen. We are going to take on and change the fate of Ohio. We're going to deal with the other Ohio if people have that exact same sense of determination. Some communities aren't going to make it just because of what's happening in rural Ohio and cynicism. But the fact is, the salmon will come home to spawn again if there's a place for them to come home to. Why am I talking about salmon? I don't talk about boomerangers coming back. I think about kids coming back to breed, so that's good. So on this note, I'm sure I'm way over my time. I thank you for your patience, and I'll pay attention to directions as to whether I have time to answer questions or not.
We do have a schedule, we do have time for a couple questions, so please, I'll let you figure out who you take.
Why am I so surprised that Gene was the first one to raise his hand? Gene.
Yeah, so you're stuck in an elevator with Michael Wine. The elevator breaks. You're now in there. What do you tell the governor to do?
Jump. On this particular issue, we have to, we've already gone down the road of the state doling out money through programs across the state and ended up with cement planters everywhere that did nothing. What we really need to do is how can the state provide incentives for places to invest in their own future? That's the single most important thing. The second thing is that if there is a community that's notoriously corrupt, send in the special prosecutors. Nothing happens until that's cleaned up. And it still exists in parts of Ohio. The other thing, third, which won't happen politically, is if a county has less than 40,000 people, abolish the county. Because it cannot support itself. I would keep the county name. Maybe you can put the county name on a sheriff's vehicle. But the tough thing is there are enough people that make their living off of the remains of dying and declining counties that politically it's impossible. And then probably the single most important thing, I would not say to the governor, I'd say to the staff, because it's way too in the weeds for the governor, but just what I challenged you with. Let's figure out what works. What worked in Worcester? What worked in Chardon? And that's really important. Not with a long paper or picture book. Figure out what barriers were removed. But that's a long list, so the elevator would have crashed and I would never get to the end of it.
Just one more question.
Okay, Bill?
I'm actually more of a comment and
Well, I'm not surprised either.
a seventh question to add to your list. And that question is, do your citizens have a compelling message? You're talking about Portsmouth raised a memory. About 10 years ago, I took a random road trip down to Portsmouth and stopped and had breakfast at this coffee shop. And I asked the server, what is there to see and do here? She pointed me across the river. You drive 30 miles into Kentucky, there's something wonderful. So I kind of ignored that.
This may sound kind of funny,
All morning.
but I now drink tea at 2 p.m. I also drink tea and coffee sometimes in the morning, but now at 2 p.m.,
No.
I'm starting to drink
Right.
tea.
But no, I think that's actually is a wonderful
Must be
idea.
limited or getting really old, which is probably the latter. Top of the morning to you. Keep drinking tea.
That is
Yeah,
correct.
see, Hey,
So one of the things there is you find out a lot of people really don't know their own communities. And
know, man.
so
Watch my-
anyway, yeah, I'll add that. Thank you.
get up, eat coffee, drink coffee, drink tea during the day. Now I'm doing.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Ned. Please thank Ned. For everybody, we'll take a. Thanks so much for coming back after the break. I'm very pleased to invite our next speaker up, Dr. Zoe Pakis, who's in our department, the Department of Agricultural, Environmental Development, and Economics. Takes a PhD to say that full department name. Zoe's been with us now for 4 years, 3 years, 4 years, 3 years. She is a graduate of UC Davis with a PhD and got her undergraduate degree from Western Washington. I guess I would probably say that she's probably from somewhere out there on the West Coast, that'd be my guess, but not. She'll let us know about that. Anyways, I don't want to take any more of her time. Zoe, look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Down to my level. Great. So thank you, Brent. It's a pleasure to be here today and speaking to all of you. So I actually grew up in Massachusetts, in the western rural part of the state. It does exist for those of you who have not been there. Rolling hills and small farms and such. Can everyone hear me through this? Okay. Great. So what that means is that the last 3 years have been my first 3 years in the Midwest. Before that, I was bi-coastal. So I'm coming to you as a bi-coastal millennial, which you may say, oh no, and I get that. But I do think that perspective is valuable because there are more of us moving to this area, moving to Columbus, moving to Ohio, maybe to your areas, or coming back to those areas from the places that I have lived. And so I want to, bring that perspective and share that perspective to you as someone who's kind of a recent transplant to Ohio. And I'm not going to be able to tell the stories about the ballpark opening and all that you've heard already. But I'll try to share some of my experiences from some other places and how they could be adapted, not adopted, to what's going on in Ohio. So first, why food and agriculture? I know we have some of our folks who look at agriculture who are in kind of primarily agricultural counties might be here today. But we also have a wider swath of folks who might not be so involved in what's going on in our agricultural economy in Ohio. So I just want to mention kind of two things that are really unique and important to Ohio agriculture and to the food economy more broadly. And I'm going to be kind of zooming out to think about the food system more broadly because I think that's an important way to think about our food and agricultural economy here. So first, agriculture remains an important activity in a number of rural Ohio communities. It's not as important as it was, just as agriculture is not as important as it was in most places in the United States, right, where we've just seen a movement out of agriculture and into urban areas. So this is something that is a very common transition that we see as economies develop over time. Our state also there's this rich agricultural tradition, right? You can't spell agriculture without culture, right? So that is a part of our rural communities, and it's important to folks that remain there. And our state also contains or is proximate, of course, to many urban centers of the U.S. And the consumers living in them, right? Folks like me who have, I live in South Columbus. I moved here from California, right? So we're here and we're buying your stuff and we're visiting small towns and cities around the state. So I want to talk a little bit about the geography of food and agriculture in Ohio. And the next few slides are thanks to some work that was done by some of my colleagues, including Brent Songen, who's been the moderator today, and Ben Brown, who I'm sure many of you know because he's just out everywhere all the time. I don't know how he does it around the state. And several years ago, we put out a report called Economic Contribution of Food and Agriculture in Ohio, right? So we were looking at how do the different kind of sectors of food and agricultural production and processing and retailing contribute to our Ohio economy as a whole. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's divided across space because there might be some areas that surprise you. For those of you where it's your area, you're going to say, oh yeah, I knew that. But around the state, there's some interesting kind of characteristics to talk about. So first thing, as some of you know who are in the agriculture space, the agriculture census just came out, the 2017 agricultural census. So we have some new data just in the last couple weeks. I just want to tell you a little bit about farming first. So the number of farms in Ohio increased from 2012 to 2017. Okay? What we do see is that the number of small farms and the number of large farms increase, the number of medium-sized farms decrease. Okay, this is a trend that we see a lot in agriculture. We call it the missing middle, right? Or agriculture of the middle is that group in the center that's getting squeezed quite a bit, right? The small farms, however, are growing at a faster rate than the large farms, and we do see, although the number of farms increase, the sales of agricultural products decline slightly. So they aren't huge changes, but these are the changes that we're seeing. Now, what's also happened over time is we've become incredibly productive, right, at turning inputs, labor, other types of inputs, right, into agricultural outputs. We're incredibly productive, and that's wonderful, okay? But it also has meant that we might need fewer people to do that work over time. It's meant that we have huge amounts of these crops in our communities, and that can hurt prices, right? So we're seeing some of the effects of that, and Ben Brown and some of my other colleagues spend a lot of time talking about that around the state, and I think we'll continue to this summer. So I encourage you to listen to them as they're around the state about that. But I want to kind of just give that context for where we are in Ohio with food and agriculture. So one of the things that we looked at in this report that we put out was this value added from food and agriculture. So this is one way to measure the importance of food and agriculture in various parts of Ohio, right? And so the value added for a sector is sales minus input costs. So the amount of value that's added by a particular part of the supply chain. Okay? So sometimes we'll hear we'll look at total sales numbers and we'll use that as some kind of marker. What's important to think about is if a product is coming through your community at 1 or 2 or 3 stages of the supply chain, what is your community doing to add value to that product, right? That's the value creation, right, is coming from not just that total sales, but taking something, an input, and doing something productive with it, right, relating to some of what Ned was saying. So this is consistent with the measurement of gross state product, right? So this is a nice way for us to think about where we're creating value around the state. So I want to talk about the role of food and agriculture and value added in 2 different ways. One is looking at the state level, and one is looking at the county level. Okay? So we can look at value added by county from these 2 perspectives. Okay, and so if we think about the state level, okay, then what we have is these are where we are creating the most value, right, in the state. When we think about the county level shares of value add, we're saying where are the counties that have the kind of most reliance on agriculture as a part of their economy, right? These are the counties where they might have a large share of their value added in the county is coming from agriculture, but they're still potentially not the largest players in the state, right? So these are 2 important things to think about, and they're distinctly different, right? Because if you're thinking about economic development on a state scale, right, and thinking about developing your food and agricultural economy, you're going to look at those areas where the value added is highest in the state. If you're thinking about this on a county or a regional level, you need to be thinking about, you know, what is agriculture and food processing as a share of our county's value added, okay? So it's important to distinguish those 2. So here are some maps. I'm gonna go through some of these. And what I've done here is I have the top 5 counties, okay? And this is as a share of state value added, okay? So this is their rank, okay? This is value added from agricultural production, okay? And the sectors in parentheses are the sectors within that county that are driving that number, not entirely, right, but are the highest, okay, in that county. So when we look within agricultural production, right, we have a number of kind of subsectors, okay? So what we see is that when we look at value added, right, we have these service sectors, right, that are very important. Inputs, we have machinery, right, we have various types of folks that are supporting our farm sector. And we see that we have some livestock-based products here, right? We have poultry and egg production, dairy and milk production. Ben's told me that he expects, so this is dated, this is a couple years old, 2015. Ben said he expects Wayne County to drop out because of the decrease in dairy processing that we might be seeing there. I see some nodding heads here. Okay, so this, just to tell you about these numbers, we're hoping to have new numbers out this summer to update these a little bit. So look for that on Ben's website. He puts together county profiles, and you can also, I think, get those from your extension agents in your counties to understand this from a county perspective. Okay, so what we see when we're looking at the state, these are our big areas, right? We see some central parts of the state, right, where we see services to be a big deal. We see that dairy processing, and then again we see over in the western part of the state where we see a lot of that agriculture. We see these two value-added areas. Now, when we look at counties, okay, we see some of the same, but we see it's all moved over to the western part of the state, right? So these are the counties where agriculture is the largest share of their county value added, right? So if you're looking at a local perspective, these are the places that you want to be thinking about. This is something that's unique and special and important in these areas. And again, we see the same sectors are coming out as high in value added. Now we move to food and ag processing. Okay, this was interesting to me and interesting to some of us in our department who've looked at these data. Of course, we see, this is urban areas, right? We're seeing Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus. And we're seeing this really dominated by beverage processing, right? We're seeing that is the dominant industry here. So, right, the various Anheuser-Busch, right? We have the various beer processing, for example, and we have other food processing. I think Stark County is the Smucker's processing. We see some big food processors that are playing a role here. Now, interestingly, so that's the state, and that shouldn't be surprising to any of us. But when we look at the county level, again, right, what we see that this is a little bit more scattered, right? So this I think is interesting to look at. Holmes County pops up for wood, paper, and furniture. So we're trying to kind of be broad in our in looking at some of this. But again, we see now when we look at counties, we see much more diversity of who is processing food, right? It's not centered around our urban areas. So if these are some of your counties, right? You are in the state among the top folks in processing, right? In terms of the reliance on processing. Okay, so that's something that's unique about the character of your area relative to other parts of the state. And when we look, I haven't given the ranges of percentages, but we see in a lot of these some really wide ranges of how much processing we see in counties in the highest and lowest. Okay, so we see anywhere from 0.5% of that value of the value added in the county is coming from processing all the way to something like 16, right? So we see large ranges. A lot of diversity in Ohio on this front. And just to highlight this also, and when we did our report, something that was interesting was we actually using some Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and I think Brent put this together, we actually saw that there's been a slowdown in productivity in the food and agricultural and the wood sector. And we have not explored that yet, but we found it very interesting. We found it surprising. Maybe some of you have anecdotal information in your communities where you've seen some of that. Given the amount that we focus on agriculture in the state, I think it's interesting to think about if we broaden this out to think about food processing, agricultural processing, are we thinking expansively about what our agricultural and food economy looks like? Then when we get to wholesale retail, so this doesn't include bars and restaurants. Again, percentage of state, no surprise here, we see the urban areas coming out on top here, okay? Just in terms of the value added. But again, once we look at this around the state, we see other areas popping up, right? When we look at this, the percentage of county. Now this has very little variability. Why? Because every area's got to have a grocery store of some kind, right? We do have food deserts in Ohio. We'll talk about that in a second, right? But we do have this small share of our economy that's always going to be made up by food retailing and wholesaling, because we're getting folks to the people in these areas who want to consume it, right? Okay, so I just wanted to kind of give an idea of the geography. Some of that might have surprised you if you're not from some of these areas. And then the other thing I want to talk about is food security, right? Because we talk a lot about food production, and we're thinking about economic development. I just want to say a little something about, the folks who are in need in Ohio. And food security is the household level economic condition of limited or uncertain access to adequate food. So why is it important? Well, aside from the moral implications, which I hope we all can agree on, right? Food insecurity, right, could prevent individuals from being productive members of their local communities, right? So as we're thinking about doing all of these great activities that Ned was suggesting, we need to think about, are people able to participate in that, or are they just wondering how they're going to get enough food for the day or the week? And it suggests that the food system that we have, although we are very good at producing food in the state of Ohio, agricultural products and food products, suggests our food system is not fully serving our communities. So as we're thinking about, again, how to build these places into nice places to live, whatever that means, I also cannot define it, right, that we need to think about these folks. So just a little map here, there's a great Feeding America, which is of course kind of an umbrella for a lot of food banks around the country, worked with some agricultural economists, and they have some really great data that's just out this year around food insecurity at the county level nationally. So if you're interested in exploring this at your local level, I highly suggest that you dig into it. Looks at adult and child food insecurity. So what we see here is Appalachian Ohio. Okay, we see some rural areas. We also see some urban areas. So getting to Ned's point about the issues that are facing our communities in the other Ohio and the forgotten Ohio, right? We see that right here, right? We see that we have Athens County, right, is our highest, nearly 20% of individuals in Athens County are in food insecure households.
Well, that's because they're offering food contracts at the university.
Okay.
That was a joke.
You might know more than that in Athens County than I do. I'm sure you do. So, okay, that's good. All right. So I haven't dug into this. That may or may not be a joke from Ned. But I think we need to keep this in mind, right? As we're thinking about our communities, do our folks in our communities have even the ability to engage, or they just focus on meeting their basic needs, right? Okay, so where am I going to go from here? Now, one of my areas of research is local and regional food systems. So certainly this is not a huge part, and I'll tell you the numbers of our entire food and agricultural economy, but it's something that folks look to, especially in some of our rural areas, but also in urban areas, as they're thinking about creative placemaking and anchor institutions and attracting people. And so something I think is relevant to our discussion today, and Ned did a really great intro for me for the last 40 minutes, and I'll try to connect back to what he said. So why local? Some of you may focus on purchasing some of your expenditures locally, but consumers see local and direct purchasing, right, as a way to get fresher, better tasting food, eat healthier, support their community, and acquire food from a source that they trust. Now, I'm not saying as an economist that we have shown that eating local does all of these things, right? But this is the perception, and that's important. This is what people are looking for. This is why people are engaging in their local food systems, right? And at the bottom, the reason that I highlighted trust is because I think this is really the key, right? We're hearing this in a lot of different situations that folks have lost trust in the food system, right? They are, and we hear this, the big bad corporation kind of narrative in a broader area than just in food and agriculture, right? That folks are not trust the businesses that they're purchasing from to make decisions that are in their best interest or that meet their values, right? And increasingly, millennial consumers like me, we are interested in fair, sustainable, healthy, right? We can think of all of these adjectives to describe our food. Can we ensure that the businesses that we're purchasing from are providing that, right? That's the question. When you go to a farmer's market, even if you don't ask the question, you know where those folks live, right? If something goes wrong, if you see something that doesn't look okay, you can say, hey, you know, Lucy, Joe, what happened? This isn't okay with me. You can have that conversation, right? And so even if people don't have that conversation, the ability to have it creates this environment of trust, right? Which I think, you know, Ned really emphasized trust and honesty as being a key part of this placemaking. So I want to emphasize trust because I think it's important as we think about the role of local and regional food systems to consider, well, if people really want trust, that's broader than just those systems, right? And I think that we need to think about the role of trust more moving forward if we're, again, playing the long game, as I think everybody wants to do here. Another thing to think about is local food as an amenity, right? And when Ned and I first met about talking about this day to day, we talked about how there's this kind of continuum, and I hope it's okay if I talk about this, Ned, I'm giving you credit here. Okay, but there's this continuum from, you know, just kind of meeting basic needs and just the most kind of basic foods, all the way to this kind of entertainment version of food, right? And my husband, when we lived in Davis, California, which is known nationally for its farmers market, he used to call the farmers market the Davis Dog and Baby Show, right? Because it was a place for people to gather, right? More than it was even a place for people to buy food. You know, as we look generationally, millennials still like to go to the grocery store. Like, they haven't entirely given up and shop at Amazon and the farmers market only, right? We overstate some of these trends, right, related to consumption. Folks still, you know, want to be able to go to the grocery store and get many of the things that they need. But increasingly, people are seeing these places like farmers markets as these places as a third space, right, as another place to engage in their communities. Right? And so that's what we see communities doing, is using that as a gathering place. Also, sales from food away from home have increased over time, and we see that we have sales from, you know, various non-sit-down, I guess the term, I'm playing out the term now, but non-sit-down restaurants, right, where you have some kind of like low service kind of restaurant, like a counter service. You know, food trucks are all the rage right now. Right, so we're seeing millennials increasingly are interested in some of those other kind of lower levels of service for their food away from home. Okay, so local and direct sales. Now, how we have some brand new numbers from the agricultural census for 2017. So the sales of $198 million in 2017, which was through direct sales. Okay, so this is about 2% of Ohio farm sales, so again, it's a drop in the bucket. I think that's about what it is nationally too, in terms of just the share of total agricultural sales. And 40% of these sales are directly to consumers in Ohio. So that's your farmers market, your CSAs, which is community supported agriculture, right? Roadside stands, things like that. So that's 40% of that. When we think about direct-to-consumer sales, which is often where we go immediately in our minds when we think local, right? We think of those face-to-face interactions. We saw from 2007 to 2012 that there was a decline in the number of farmers selling directly to consumers and a decline in the revenue per farm from selling directly to consumers. So it seemed like that was cooling a little bit. These new numbers, and this is actually a typo, the trend changed from 2012 to 2017. So in the last 5 years of this ag census that we just got the data for, we see that there continues to be a decline in the number of farmers selling directly to consumers, a small decline, but there is a huge increase percentage-wise in average revenue per farm selling directly to consumers. We saw the average go up in Ohio from $7,050 to $12,955. That's a huge increase, right? So these are small numbers, right? These aren't the big numbers that are driving kind of the value added in our economy that I was talking about earlier. But they are showing that this is really a hot area for Ohio, the increases that we're seeing. So then where is the other 60% of this food going, though, if it's not going directly to consumers? Well, it's going to institutions. It's going to places like Ohio State, which is committed to source 40% of its food locally and sustainably by 2025. And the definition of that, I could not tell you exactly. They've been working on it for a long time. Retailers, right? We see grocery stores, restaurants, caterers are all purchasing, and we see these intermediaries. Food hubs, the Ohio West Virginia Food Hub Network is based out of the South Centers. at Piketon, and they are, helping folks across those 2 states to start food hubs. So these are intermediaries that are branding and selling locally. And we have, because of this interest in local, we are seeing a number of intermediaries outside of that kind of food hub space, right? Other types of distributors or buyers who are purchasing food and branding it locally, right? So that they can take advantage of that interest by consumers. So what are the impacts of all this, right? Ultimately, we want to understand how does this affect our communities. So some recent work, a number of folks contributed to this. It was published by the Federal Reserve, and I can provide a link later on the website. Using economic impact analysis found statistically insignificant gains, again being depressing in my hypothesis testing. I see men smiling over there. Or some positive gains, small positive gains for regions. Okay, why so small, right? We hear this narrative about food. Well, really, my kind of thoughts here is this is really about opportunity costs, right? When we are investing in our local food systems, it really matters where the resources came from, what they were doing before, right? So key resources in local food systems are people, right, and land, among other things. And if they were taken out of other productive activities to move into local food systems, then we're not creating a whole lot of new value, right? We're just shifting that value to another sector, right? So when we look at that, just from a kind of economic standpoint, we have to consider, what value is this adding? So if we were thinking, well, hey, we want to be able to add value with this, not just get this small positive gain, we need to think about in communities, what are the underutilized resources, right? Is there land that's not being used? We talked a little bit about land banks, right? Is there land that's not being used for productive purposes? Are there people who are having a difficult time getting jobs? Are they previously incarcerated? Are they recovering from addiction, right? Is there some group that is not fully engaged in our workforce? Can we employ those underutilized resources and engage them in our food system investments, right? That's where we're gonna see the biggest gains rather than just shifting people and land from other productive activities. Some additional impacts that I want to talk about. Obviously, profitability is going to be important for the sustainability of these operations. Okay, and marketing directly and locally often requires farmers to take on more marketing costs than marketing through traditional channels, right? So we often, one of the colloquial things we hear is that, well, farmers are getting a larger share of the food dollar if they market directly. Well, yes, but they're also spending a larger share of the food dollar on all of their inputs and their time, right? So marketing costs really vary widely. That's the evidence, and we see that the profitability is higher for smaller scales of production. When we get to larger scales, it's those marketing costs really add up. That should be very intuitive to us, and that there is evidence that it's possible to also overinvest in these systems. Okay, so if we're so focused on local foods that you actually create competition in your community with local branding, you can't simply keep expanding. Local is a key part of it. So you can oversaturate by having too much entry of businesses that are all focused in this local food space. So that's something we have to be cognizant of because of the limited space in these areas. Almost done. We also have some less tangible impacts, and I think these really relate to what Ned was talking about, the nice place to be and placemaking, and some of the things that as economists that we have a very difficult time putting our finger on. We would like to be able to quantify them to give some dollar value because we like to put everything in that common unit of currency, but it's very difficult to do that. And I would say some of our colleagues in other fields are really trying to understand this in different ways that might be more suited to the task. But these less tangible impacts are community engagement, education of urban consumers, which we know is very important, especially in a state where we have this rural and urban group, and building entrepreneurial capacity, which of course is incredibly important for us to be able to develop and to get people invested in the way that I think Ned was talking about. Okay, so a few last slides just about the future of local food systems. So one question, if you're investing in these systems and you're playing the long game, is will interest in local last, right? This is actually a fairly new phenomenon that we see, this premium for local food. And as I said earlier, the reason I emphasize trust is that local preferences are really based on concerns about trust. So my view on this is that as larger food companies work to increase consumer trust, like through third-party certifications, other kinds of commitments that they make to their workers related to environmental concerns, that the role of the local food as their most trusted resource could decrease, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind. And so thinking ahead, I would encourage you, if you're interested in investing in this space in your community, to think about how will your investments fare as tastes and preferences of consumers change, right? How will your community be resilient to changes if local branding is not the be all end all? How can you maintain trust and engagement when that is no longer as much of a fad? And finally, I want to say something about food insecurity, because I talked about that earlier, and I think it's so important. And it's local food investments are often used as this one of the kind of taglines is, oh, we'll be able to provide food to our poorest, neediest folks, and not necessarily, right? This is possible, but it's not just going to come naturally from your investments in this area. So affluent consumers are willing to pay a premium for local. But many food insecure households may not be able to. There are increasingly government programs to help support this, but actually, interestingly, we've seen some research recently that's saying that in food deserts, right, areas where we thought that we were seeing food insecurity because people didn't have access to food and it was just a physical issue. We're actually seeing that part of the food insecurity is coming from differences in demand, right? That across our different communities, we see that we don't have maybe the preferences for fresh kale that my millennial colleagues at OSU do in maybe some of our inner city neighborhoods, right? We don't see those same preferences, okay? And that's not a judgment, but something that we have to consider as we think about, what are the ways that we can address food insecurity. So if this is an issue that your community is facing, then it's important to carefully consider the local food investments in the context of whatever the community is that you are interested to support, who's food insecure, and be communicating with them. Again, coming from the community is the best way you're going to be able to solve this. They're going to be able to tell you what they need. And with that, thank you very much.